Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome to anyone who's new. Firstly, thank you so much to all of you that have been engaging with my videos so far. I'm really new to this whole YouTube thing, so your support really means a lot. To say thank you, I've slipped a £10 discount code into this video, which is valid to use on all variegated monsteras in the TheJungleHaven shop, so keep watching. I put a poll on my Instagram story this week asking if you'd be more interested to see a video on fiddle leaf figs or variegated monsteras. I chose those two just because I get a lot of questions about them. But as you probably guessed from the name of this video, you voted for monsteras. Especially recently, variegated monsteras have been glamorized a hell of a lot on social media. This is definitely not a reason purely just to buy one. There are so many gorgeous plants out there that might be way more suited to you and your home as well. So don't let that dictate the plants and lots of other things that you like and don't like. Always do your research before buying a new plant. There's nothing worse than buying a lovely expensive plant that you end up killing in the first few weeks because you've no idea how to take care of it. I think about that phase that all those celebrities went through when having a fiddle leaf fig was like the trendiest thing ever. Do you see them posting about them anymore? No, because they bought them as a fashion statement and then they killed them. And that just makes me sad. There are three main types of variegated monstera. Obviously, it's important to know exactly which one you want because they're definitely not cheap plants. They're rare and can be super hard to get hold of. This is because most of the ones that you usually see are either sold as cuttings or reproduced through propagation, which is time consuming and not always 100% effective. I'll quickly sum them up just in case anyone's not sure which is which. Monstera albo borsigiana, Monstera Thai constellation, and Monstera marmorata, which is also known as Monstera aurea. It can sometimes be quite hard to tell the difference between them and therefore quite difficult to choose if you're thinking of buying one. Monstera marmorata, I'm going to call it Monstera aurea. Monstera aurea is usually the easiest to spot because the variegation tends to be more kind of yellow in colour as opposed to white. The leaves are really similar to your standard Monstera Deliciosa and they can grow to be huge. Albo borsigiana and Thai constellation can often be confused because the variegation on their leaves can actually look quite similar. They both tend to have white or greeny white variegation that can come in splashes, patches, or can actually sometimes cover the whole leaf. The ones I've got here are all albos and they're personally my favourite if I had to choose. With albos, their variegation occurs naturally and it's essentially a mutation of chromosomes that's preserved through chopping and propagating, and obviously it just looks really pretty. On the whole, albos leaves don't tend to grow much bigger than about 30 centimetres, but that's still pretty huge. Monstera Thai constellation is essentially a man-made mutation, so it's not a natural process, although they can still be propagated and behave in the same way as all the others. As I said, their variegation tends to be greeny white or white, but you can sometimes get splashes of yellow as well. On the whole, it tends to be more speckled. On the whole, it tends to be more speckled or flecked than an albo, but that isn't always the case. In mature plants, their leaves can grow to be about 60 centimetres, which is massive. I won't get too scientific, but the Thai constellation is essentially cloned in a lab through a process called tissue culture, but this actually being done is still extremely rare. And there are far more important things for people to be doing in labs than cloning pretty plants. The way to tell an albo from a Thai constellation is mainly the fact that an albo has much more of a kind of tall, viney look, and the leaves are spaced out more. This basically means that what's known as the internodal spacing, I know it needs a new moss pole, the internodal spacing is a lot bigger, meaning that it's essentially easier to chop and propagate if you want to. I don't actually own a Thai constellation, but I'm going to compare the nodal spacing on it to a normal Monstera Deliciosa, just because it's fairly similar. As you can see, the internodal spacing here is a lot kind of more condensed, which means that your plant is probably going to look a lot fuller and bushier, but it does also mean that it can be harder to chop and propagate. It's really just down to personal preference, but as I say, I personally love albos. Caring for a variegated monstera isn't actually that much different to caring for a normal Monstera Deliciosa, which is pretty straightforward. They're fairly hardy plants. One thing that you really need to take into account is that the white variegated parts of the plant actually can't absorb light in the same way as the green part, which means that they have to work twice as hard in order to photosynthesize. Placing them by an east-facing window would probably be optimum conditions, just because it only gets morning sunlight and still remains bright throughout the day. If you place your plant in lower light conditions, it'll probably still survive, but over time you'll probably notice the variegation start to decrease. And if you've paid a lot of money for a variegated monstera, this isn't ideal. I don't mean that the existing variegation will fade, but as new leaves start to unfurl, you'll probably notice they start to become less and less variegated. An example of this is if you look at the bottom leaves here on my one, as it starts to go up, you can notice the variegation just becomes a little bit less. Besides the genetics of the plants, which can definitely play a role, this has happened because I haven't always lived somewhere that has the optimum lighting conditions that it needs. The best way to preserve the variegation in your plant, if you do notice it starting to fade, is to chop and propagate it just below the leaf node where you notice that it's starting to fade. So in my case, probably around here. This will just encourage the variegation to stay strong in the existing mother plant, and also it will give you lots of, in my case, plant babies to propagate. It's just started to thunder. What good timing. Variegated monsteras like to be watered around once a week, depending on the conditions of your home, but it's just really good to monitor the soil. As I've said before, underwatering is always better than overwatering. So if you're not quite sure whether or not you should water, I would advise leaving it a couple of days and then checking back. With these plants, it's so important to let at least the top couple of inches of soil completely dry out before you even think about rewatering, because they don't enjoy sitting in soggy soil. And this can lead to things such as fungal diseases and root rot. Albos particularly, for some reason, are really susceptible to root rot. I personally just stick my finger a couple of inches down into the soil and just feel to see how dry it is. But as I've said before, if you're not quite sure, you can also use a moisture meter for this. Again, just a reminder that if you've got a water softener in your home, don't risk using this water to water your plants, as the sodium levels are super high and it can just be too much for them to cope with. It's so important to make sure that you're using a well-draining pot. Some people like to use terracotta pots. They can absorb a lot of the excess moisture. I personally use ceramic pots, but what I'll do is I'll keep my plant in its nursery pot and just put that into the pretty pot. That way I can take it out and make sure that it's completely drained before I put it back in. I also will always give my nursery pots a really good squeeze before I water them, as well as giving the base of the stem just a gentle wiggle, just because this helps to improve the aeration in the soil by making it less compact, and it also strengthens the roots. I would recommend fertilising about once or twice a month during growing season. I always use this fertiliser, which is available to buy in my shop. I'll link it down below. It doesn't contain any nasty, harsh chemicals. It's completely natural and is perfect for healthy growth. During the winter months, it's really important to just lay off the fertiliser. If you do continue to fertilise over the winter, chances are you're probably going to start to notice brown patches appearing on your plant's leaves. This is known as fertiliser burn, and it basically happens because your plant doesn't need any extra energy to grow during that time, and the extra nutrients can be too much for it and can actually send them into shock. This applies to all plants, and I've said it before, but make sure you are dusting your plant's leaves regularly, wiping them down on both sides and turning them every few weeks or so that they can absorb maximum light from all sides. As always, take the time whilst doing this to check for pests. Touch wood. These plants are fairly resilient when it comes to pests compared to a lot of others, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. I have seen thrips on a monstera before, so it's always sensible to check. I've completely lost my train of thought. Soil. In terms of soil, I've mentioned the mix that I used before, so I will link it up here. You definitely don't have to use the same mix that I use. I just find it works really well and I enjoy playing about with soil. So if you fancy it, give it a go. The most important thing to remember when you're choosing soil for your variegated monstera is that it includes stuff that is going to heighten the aeration in the soil, as well as helping with drainage, because again, root rot. In terms of aeration, I basically mean something that's not going to leave the soil too compact, that keeps lots and lots of air in there so that your roots can breathe. Definitely don't just jump in with your bog standard potting mix, as that is going to be way too dense. You can add core, perlite, orchid bark mix, sphagnum moss. As long as you've got that, all the little extra additives that I like to use in my mix don't matter too much here. Variegated monsteras, especially albos and Thai constellations particularly, enjoy high levels of humidity, more so than your average Monstera Deliciosa. They're not as sensitive to lower humidity levels compared to some other plants. That being said, I would say they need to be at least 60% humidity. I always try to keep the humidity in my house at about 65% plus, just because my plants really love it and it's really good for us too. You can crank it up even more. It will only do your plants good and you as well. If your humidity levels are really low, then chances are you'll start to notice brown patches on the leaves, cracking as well. For some reason, the white parts of the leaves are really sensitive to this. If you don't have a humidifier, misting your plants can be a really great way to temporarily raise the humidity levels. But unless you're going to be misting them all the time, this isn't particularly sustainable. Misting also helps to clean the leaves and discourage any nasty pests from setting up camp. If you're someone that absolutely loves caring for their plants, but maybe a bit too much, you're an overwaterer, I always think misting is a really great way to kind of regulate this. It allows you to spend lots of time with your plants and bonds with them, but it won't leave you in the position where you've essentially loved them too much and killed them. For balanced, healthy growth, they like the temperature to be about 18 to 27 degrees Celsius. They're really not a fan of drafts either, so when you're placing your plant, just make sure that it's away from drafty doors and windows. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I've currently got lots of beautiful variegated monsteras that I'm slowly starting to list in my shop, as well as lots of others propagating for further down the line. All of them are listed individually, so the plant that you see in the photo will be the exact plant that you receive. If you're tempted and do fancy buying one, simply use the code JungleYouTube, all one word, at the checkout, and you'll get £10 off any variegated monstera you choose. This is exclusively for you lot to say thank you so much for supporting me on my YouTube venture so far. This £10 discount code will be valid until the 1st of January 2021. You'll often see pictures of variegated monsteras with completely white leaves, and obviously these are stunning and people go crazy over them. The thing that a lot of people don't realise is that although yes, these leaves are beautiful, they actually don't have any chlorophyll in them, so they really don't last very long. They cannot absorb any light. You can either wait for these leaves to naturally die back, which will usually happen within a month or two, or you can prune them back to balance out the variegation. This is done in the same way I spoke about earlier in terms of preserving the variegation, but by chopping just below the node of the super white leaf. It just encourages your plant to pump out more healthy, balanced growth that's going to be more sustainable in the long run. And it'll mean that the rest of your plant isn't having to work so hard in order to support a leaf that essentially can't support itself. But I get that that's a really sad thing to have to do. I don't know if I could bring myself to do it. One thing that I try to do for all my plants, but particularly my special plants, is during growing season, give them a thorough soak through with pure unfertilised water. Particularly for this purpose, I always try to use filtered water or, if possible, rainwater, just because it's got far less chemicals than tap water, and the point of this is to detoxify the soil. Doing this means watering them a lot more than you usually would in one go. This is to essentially rinse out the soil and get rid of any salt or mineral buildup that might have collected. This buildup can prevent your plant absorbing the water and nutrients from the soil that it needs in order to grow. After doing this, it's important to let your plant stand in its nursery pot so that it can drain really well. I'd say leave it to stand for a good hour, just to make sure it's had enough time to properly drain. If you watched my video on Calathea care, then you'll probably remember I actually unboxed a variegated monstera cutting in the middle of it. I'm currently recording its process as it propagates, and we'll be bringing that to you as a vlog at some point soon, and talking specifically about propagating a variegated monstera from cuttings. I might even cut my big baby back. I don't know. That's going to be hard. Let me know if that's something you'd like to see, and maybe I'll do it. One last thing I want to add is, if you are thinking of buying a variegated monstera, make sure you get it from a reputable seller or grower. So many times I've heard of people spending a huge amount of money just for a cutting, and it will arrive in either awful condition or with no nodes, so it's impossible to propagate. People know how sought after they are, and they know how much people are going to be willing to spend to get one. And there's a lot of scammers out there that just want to make some fast cash. Just do your research before launching it and buying one, is all I will say. I really hope this video was useful and you feel more equipped now to potentially parent one of these plants. If you're enjoying my videos so far, please make sure to give them a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell to be the first to know when the JungleHaven posts new videos. Also, make sure you're following us on social media: Instagram @TheJungleHaven, Facebook TheJungleHaven. Stay tuned for more weekly plant videos.